It's September 14th, 1973, and life is grand for 31-year-old Donnie Rudd and his blushing new bride, 19-year-old Noreen. Married just 27 days, they have their whole lives ahead of them.
Donnie was recently divorced with 6 children and stepchildren, but the couple doesn't care about any of that. They're in love.
After an enjoyable visit with Noreen's mother, Irene, the pair head home along a dark and desolate stretch of Route 63 near Barrington Hills, Illinois, on September 14th, 1973. They don't even notice their Ford isn't alone on the road that night. In the blink of an eye, and with a bright flash of headlights, Donnie and Noreen's marriage is over, and so is Noreen's life.
It was just heartbreaking.
What happened out there on that road? Who was driving the other car? There are so many unanswered questions.
It would take more than 4 decades, another untimely demise, and shocking new details from the most unlikely source of all, Noreen Rudd herself, before those questions are answered and the person responsible is behind bars for committing a brutal murder. Chicago in the 1970s. A booming time for the most populous city in the American Midwest.
Despite a rough and tumble reputation and a history of segregation, all of that is starting to turn around in the Windy City, with its well-known blues music scene and impressive arts community. Then, in 1973, the tallest building in the world, the Sears Tower, opens, and finally puts Chicago on the world stage as a center for business and a true metropolis.
But not everyone is enjoying the bustling success of Chi-Town. In the spring of 1973, Noreen Kumeta lives with her mother Irene and younger sister in the working-class neighborhood after her father Alfred had died years earlier.
Noreen's father didn't have a life insurance policy for the family, so without a cushion to lie on, Irene did what she could to make ends meet for her and her daughter.
Financial struggles meant that after graduating high school, the family likely would not be able to afford to send Noreen to college.
But all of that didn't matter much to the bright and bubbly blonde. She had a great job as a librarian at the Quaker Oats Company, making a respectable $4,800 a year.
And she'd met someone.
Donnie Rudd is tall, almost 6 feet, with green eyes. The kind of eyes you could get lost in if you look long enough. He's a sharp-wit lawyer with a larger-than-life personality, and there's an unshakable confidence about him. He has a big ego for sure, but overall, it's an attractive quality, and it draws people towards him. Donnie is 12 years older than her, but as much as Noreen is drawn to Donnie, so is he to her.
He also worked at Quaker Oats, but as a patent attorney with a very respectable annual salary of $18,700 per year. $106,500 in today's dollars. The happy-go-lucky young woman is a breath of fresh air in Donnie's busy world, and everything about the new relationship seems perfect, except one tiny hiccup. He's married. While studying chemical engineering at Texas A&M in College Station, he meets Luann Hart.
The couple have 2 boys and 2 girls before moving to Chicago. But that doesn't stop Donnie from enrolling at Kent College of Law, while Luann raises them.
With a fresh start in the Windy City and a burgeoning new career, Donnie thrives and takes advantage of the construction boom by working as an attorney for the condominium associations.
Donnie's law practice is massively successful. He even hosts a local legal affairs program on cable access television.
And adorns his car with Mr. Condo vanity plates.
Donnie and his wife Luann choose to raise their kids in the suburbs. Though only 15 miles from the heart of Chicago, Hoffman Estates in Cook County is a world away from the hustle and bustle.
The Village, it's a popular draw for hard-working American families. Schools, libraries, churches, and fire stations dot the suburban landscape.
In Hoffman Estates, Donnie is an active and devoted father. He's a respected member of the school board, even serving as president of the Schaumburg School District 54. While life is firing on all cylinders for Donnie, his time with Schaumburg School District 54 marks the beginning of the end for Donnie and Luann.
You see, Donnie starts getting to know his neighbor, John Hart, and John's wife, fellow school board member, Diane Hart.
My mom was very involved with us kids. She was the Girl Scout leader. She was the room mom. She was on the PTA, and eventually she ran for the school board in Schaumburg, which was School District 54. We started to do some things with their families. We spent a lot of time barbecuing. They joined the same church we belonged to, which was Bethel Baptist Church. And they were a regular figure. I babysat for their kids pretty much on a regular basis.
Diane Hart is quick-witted, quirky, and whip-smart. A lot like Donnie, actually. And they have tons in common. They both have kids, and they challenge each other on topics they're both passionate about, like the school board.
The attraction between Donnie and Diane cannot be denied. And it's not long before the two of them begin an illicit affair.
We did everything together as a family, and we were not the type of family that had this type of complication in our life back in the 1970s.
They seemed very happy. They were very religious. We were brought up Baptist. We took family vacations every year. We did all kinds of things together as a family, and we seemed very much like the perfect family. She liked the whole thrill of it. You know, being a housewife was never part of her plan. I mean, she was a member of Mensa. She was extremely smart, extremely bright. And I think my dad was just a little boring for her.
Diane Hart falls head over heels for Donnie. It becomes almost like an obsession. Then after about a year, Diane and Donnie are ready to make a move. Diane tells her husband, John, she's decided she wants to be with Donnie forever, no matter what the cost.
Found out that my mom had been cheating with Donnie, and she basically wanted to walk away from everything. She didn't want anything. She just wanted to be with him. She said, you can have the kids, you can have everything. And she was just willing to leave for him.
So, in 1972, Diane walks away from her life. She leaves her husband, and Donnie leaves Luann. Two perfect families torn apart.
Donnie moves in with Diane and her two daughters, Laurel and Cindy. And in an odd twist, Luann Rudd and John Hart, the two exes bound by their partners' betrayals, turn to each other to console their grief.
My dad and Luann had spent so much time trying to keep their spouses that they spent a lot of time with each other. My dad was there for her, and all of a sudden, they just started dating too.
And it was interesting because it sounds like it's a switcheroo where my dad ended up marrying Luann and my mom ended up with Donnie. So that almost appears like there was an agreement between the parties, but nothing could be farther from the truth.
Over at Donnie and Diane's house, the two talk frequently about getting married. But with Donnie in the middle of a divorce, and now 6 kids between them, money is really tight. Add to that the entanglement of their exes, and let's just say things are complicated.
By the spring of 1973, the honeymoon for Donnie and Diane is over. And Donnie's wandering eye starts to wander once more. This time to young librarian Noreen Kumeta.
Donnie keeps his affair with Noreen tightly under wraps. He continues to be a loving partner to Diane and a doting stepdad at home. But then, one day, in mid-August 1973, Donnie comes home and announces to his family that he's getting married, but not to Diane, to Noreen.
It's a shocking blow to the seemingly happy blended family.
He did not tell my mom he was marrying Noreen until the day before the wedding. He actually spent the night before he got married at our house in the bedroom. So nobody in our family knew that he was leaving until immediately before he married Noreen. So he got an apartment a couple blocks from the house, and he had an office there, and he would see clients there, and it seemed like he was spending more and more time there.
We had no suspicion that he was dating somebody else, much less that he was ready to marry somebody else.
My mom, I think, was becoming suspicious that Donnie had moved on from her, even though he was still spending most of the nights at our house. And it kind of came to a head one night when she followed him back to his apartment and found him, in his living room at the apartment with a young woman who she assumed was Noreen.
Donnie spends one last night with Diane, and then the next day, he moves out. Just a few days later, on August 18, 1973, Donnie Rudd and his new flame, young Noreen Kumeta, are joined in holy matrimony. And September 14, 1973, 27 days after their new life begins, it's all over. Investigating Officer Christopher Bish is one of the first on the scene. On the highway, he notes about 165 feet of skid marks. Donnie Rudd braked fast and hard. The car is off the road in the grass, stopped by bushes and a barbed wire fence.
Inside the car, Donnie's in the driver's seat with Noreen laying across the passenger seat, her head on his lap. He begins to explain the tragic accident and how she was thrown from the car and her head hit a rock. Officer Bish and another cop immediately lift Noreen out of the car and lay her on the ground. Officer Bish attempts mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. As he continues to attempt to resuscitate Noreen, he notices the back of her head is mushy.
Paramedics arrive and Noreen is rushed by ambulance to Sherman Hospital in Kane County.
But it's too late. She's already gone. The coroner declares Noreen Kumeta Rudd dead on arrival at 11:55 p.m.
Coroner Dr. Jahan notes on his examination an avulsion of Noreen's scalp. He lists the immediate cause of death is a fracture of her cervical spine suffered when she was thrown from the car, driven by her husband when it left the road. Noreen's death is ruled accidental.
It is a terrible tragedy. A young bride, her whole life ahead of her, snuffed out in an instant by an erratic driver on a deserted road. Her grieving husband, left to pick up the pieces of a future that was never meant to be.
It's a dark day as Noreen is laid to rest at Dundee Township East Cemetery. The young woman's devastated mom and sister attend the funeral, along with Donnie and his children.
Noreen Kumeta Rudd is buried in her long-sleeved, lacy white wedding dress, the very one she had worn on the happiest day of her life just a few weeks before. After Noreen's funeral, Donnie bounces back a little faster than one would expect for your average grieving spouse.
The night of Noreen's service, Donnie sleeps not at his new home he shares with his new bride, but back at the house of his ex, Diane Marks.
Donnie is again living full-time with Diane and her daughters, almost like his marriage to Noreen never happened.
It's so odd for everyone in their lives, especially the kids.
On my mom and Donnie's side, it went back to business as usual. She loved Donnie and she wanted to be with him.
He was never gone completely. He continued to call my mom during that whole month he was married to Noreen, and he still saw her. I know that I remember people were confused because nobody seemed to know that Donnie was married. Everybody still thought he was coming to our house and that he was still with my mom.
People wonder, did Diane forgive Donnie for his indiscretions because she wants to get back to the perfect relationship they had before Noreen? Or is Donnie Rudd using his charm and wit and the death of his young wife as part of some kind of bigger plan? (1973) is a difficult year for Chicago area attorney Donnie Rudd. A whirlwind affair, a quickie marriage, and a horrible car accident that claims the life of his new bride, Noreen.
But within weeks of Noreen's death, Donnie, he's back in the arms of his ex-common-law wife, Diane.
Whatever the twisted reason for Diane's forgiveness, she forgave nonetheless. And Donnie Rudd was again her one and only.
I think that she thought she was going to be the real woman, and she was still the other woman.
After Donnie and Diane move back in together, they become more committed to each other than ever. They purchase a new home in the sleepy suburb of Hoffman Estates, and in May of 1974, the reunited couple get married. They remain married for another 2 decades.
Cindy Hart remembers Donnie Rudd as a doting stepfather, but not necessarily a loving one.
We always had an okay relationship with him. I don't think he ever cared for us. It's not like I ever considered him anything close to a father.
I mean, occasionally he saw his kids, but there was, I honestly can say there was no parental feelings in Donnie, not towards us as his stepkids, but not towards his real kids either. He would sometimes buy us presents, but usually there was a reason for that.
He took extravagant vacations. You know, money never seemed to be an issue with him. He was exciting. He bought me a monkey for Christmas the year after Noreen died. He bought my sister a car. He did things, but they weren't things that were fatherly. You know, you didn't see any of that kind of, any kind of relationship like that.
That wasn't the only unusual purchase Donnie Rudd was known to make. He had an odd assortment of cobbled-together taxidermy objects, like a mounted mouse with wings. He also had a large collection of guns, including a novelty long-barrel pistol designed to look like a cane.
He used to have a collection of pipes that were made out of like ivory, and he had expensive paintings put into the house and sculptures, and it wasn't the way that we grew up. It was a very different type of style. He had fancy cars. He had one of those cars that opened up and had wings. He had a Porsche at one time. So he had a lot of very expensive things that were coming in and out of it.
And Donnie's eccentricities weren't just confined to his home life.
While practicing law in Chicago, Donnie wears cowboy boots to play up his Texas roots. He uses his larger-than-life persona to really draw people to him.
During this time, Donnie's business thrives. His law firm boasts more than 2,000 clients.
Donnie even works with then-state representative Ellis Levin to co-write amendments to the Illinois Condominium Property Act. He advertises himself as Mr. Condo.
But although Donnie Rudd is likable, talented, and smart, he doesn't always use those magnetic qualities for good. Underneath that big, friendly cowboy hat is a decidedly darker shadow.
I think that being trained as a lawyer, that made him very credible. So you started with this base of credibility. But it was interesting. I think Donnie hooked people in because he knew what you wanted to hear.
Donnie Rudd wants to be known as a lawyer who could win any case that came his way. He has a habit of telling clients he'd won their settlements when he actually hadn't.
Of course, those clients would come to him looking for payment, thinking they'd just been awarded a significant amount of money. But Donnie didn't have it. So to cover his tracks, he would write checks for small amounts from his own personal accounts. This only worked for so long. Clients were still waiting for their paydays, and people started to really lose patience when their settlement money didn't appear.
He had gone in front of the Attorney Registration Commission for several misrepresentations involving similar things where he had told people he had won their cases and they hadn't, and people complained thinking he stole the money, and it turned out he just, never got the money.
So Donnie Rudd uses another trick, claiming to be sick. Very sick. Sometimes he'd even check himself into the hospital. It is a well-worn excuse used by Donnie to earn some sympathy and buy more time.
It was always the case with Donnie. When he did something really bad and there was no way out, he would put himself in the hospital, and that way everybody else could tend to all the problems. And he wouldn't have to do it. And it was a regular routine with him. If he got himself in financial problems or he got himself in trouble with the partners, he would immediately end up in the hospital,
Basically, Donnie Rudd is stealing from his clients.
One of those clients is 59-year-old interior designer Loretta Tabak-Rodke.
True to form, Donnie Rudd takes the case. And after months of working for Loretta, he tells her she's won a settlement against her business partner and that she's owed a significant amount of money.
Loretta is over the moon, at first. But it isn't long before Donnie is up to his old tricks. Loretta is a smart cookie and knows something isn't right with this big Texas talker, and she isn't buying any of his sob stories.
When Loretta has a dispute with a business partner, she needs a lawyer, a good one, to file a lawsuit on her behalf.
But Loretta never gets to follow through on her threats, and she never sees the money from her so-called successful court settlement. On April 4th, 1991, police receive a frantic call from a distraught man in the upscale neighborhood of Arlington Heights. The man has come home and found his wife dead in their kitchen.
Police arrive at a townhouse on North Belmont Avenue and find a 59-year-old individual deceased on the floor. The man of the house discovered his wife covered in blood on the floor and called 911. The victim has been shot in the head, execution style, with a .22 caliber weapon. She's identified as Loretta Tabak-Rodke.
The killing shocks the neighborhood. A brazen afternoon murder in Arlington Heights is just unheard of. There's a lot of fear. But police aren't worried there's a random spree killer on the loose, for a couple of reasons.
Investigators have a few key pieces of evidence to start figuring out what happened. One, there's no sign of forced entry into the townhouse. That means the killer came to the door and Loretta Tabak-Rodke let them in willingly. She knew this person. And two, there's no evidence anywhere in the home of any kind of struggle. Loretta wasn't attacked or didn't try to fight off her assailant before she's executed. Three, there's no sign of any sexual trauma. This wasn't a sexually motivated crime. And four, nothing is stolen. Robbery is clearly not a motive either. A neighbor says she remembered hearing a gunshot around 3:20 p.m. She said she saw a vehicle driving on the street, but only remembers an unusual license plate, Mr. Kondo.
Police interview dozens of people and turn up mostly dead ends. Then, after exhausting nearly all avenues, they get their first real break in the case. It's a bombshell of a clue that leads police in only one direction, and to only one man. It's 1991, and Noreen Kumeta Rudd's life is a distant memory after a fatal car crash in 1973.
Her grieving husband, Donnie Rudd, has moved on with a new wife and a successful law practice.
Then, tragedy strikes again. A client of Donnie's is gunned down in cold blood in the middle of the afternoon. And police have just learned a car with the license plate Mr. Kondo was seen in the area that day.
The only person with a plate like that, Donnie Rudd.
It's a big break for homicide detectives because Mr. Kondo is a custom license plate. Drivers pay specifically to have these kinds of plates and they're registered with the DMV.
Investigators make a beeline for Donnie and bring him in for questioning. This may be an open and shut case, but the interrogation doesn't go quite according to plan.
The focus was on Donnie in that investigation from the very beginning.
Donnie Rudd sits down with police and immediately admits that yes, the eyewitness did see his car with the Mr. Kondo plates, and yes, he was at Loretta's house that day.
Donnie Rudd claims he went to see Loretta to discuss the impending lawsuit she was threatening to file against him and to drop off some paperwork. But he insists she was 100% alive when he left.
They never really could prove that Donnie did it because he acknowledged that he was there. You know, his footprints were there. He had tea there. His daughter, I believe, had called her mom and knew that Donnie was there. But there was some pretty damning evidence.
And with that stunning admission, police become handcuffed by this new information.
Donnie's admitted to being at the scene, but they have no other concrete evidence to pin the shady lawyer to Loretta's murder.
And with nothing else to go on but circumstantial suspicion, Loretta Tabak-Rodke's killing goes cold.
While Loretta's death remains unsolved, her threats to have Donnie Rudd exposed as a fraudster did not get buried with her.
So the idea was she was confronting Donnie about why she thought Donnie, I'm sure, had stole the money, but Donnie had never gotten the judgment. He just forged a document.
It's 1994, 3 years after her murder, and several complaints are filed with the Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission from others who also claim Donnie cheated them out of money. Donnie is cited for unlawful conduct, and in 1994 voluntarily withdraws his law license.
Donnie Rudd basically ruins his reputation in Chicago and Illinois. So what does he do? He takes the show on the road and returns with Diane back to his home state of Texas.
And with his confidence, smarts, and charm, Donnie does what he does very well and reinvents himself. He becomes an expert in, of all things, stem cell research.
Donnie Rudd establishes a company called Regenitech in Sugar Land, Texas, where he is listed as the chief scientist, director of intellectual property, and corporate secretary. He takes out more than 40 patents. Most are related to cell regeneration, repair of human tissue, and curing diseases to vital organs. He works with NASA to send human cells into space.
It's another fresh start, but he's unaware the past is starting to creep up on him.
For Donnie, the deaths of Noreen Kumeta Rudd and Loretta Tabak feel like a lifetime ago. But for the families of the two women, they refuse to allow the past to be buried so easily.
Detective Sperando pours through the paperwork, and he sees all the same evidence cops did at the time of the shooting.
And push for the investigations to continue.
Loretta Tabak Rodke's daughter Stephanie hates that her mother's murder remains unsolved and her killer still roams free. So she keeps up the pressure on police to re-examine the case. Finally, after years, Officer Richard Sperando of the Arlington Heights Police Department agrees to take another look.
He started reinvestigating Loretta's case, and that was because Loretta's daughter was very persistent, which, led to them talking to us again and listening.
No forced entry, no signs of a struggle, the Mr. Condo license plate, Donnie Rudd's admission he was at Loretta's house that day, but no concrete evidence to connect him to the actual murder. Sperando does notice that in the files there's a second unusual and tragic death connected to Donnie Rudd. This one from way back in 1973. The victim, Noreen Kumeta Rudd.
The police commander has worked enough cases to know when something doesn't feel right. And after reading about the fatal car accident involving Donnie and Noreen, his cop instinct kicks in. Detective Sperando decides to reach out to a colleague who was there that day, Officer Christopher Bish.
Officer Bish tells Sperando the Noreen Kumeta Rudd case has haunted him for years and years. Bish says he remembers Noreen's head being mushy as he tried to resuscitate her, and that the coroner ruled her death due to a fracture of the cervical spine, but didn't actually perform an autopsy, so he never understood how he came to that conclusion.
Detective Sperando has heard enough. He now knows there's only one person who can reveal the truth of what really happened that night in 1973. So, nearly 30 years after her death, Sperando files the paperwork to exhume the body of Noreen Kumeta Rudd.
Forensic pathologist Dr. Hilary McElligott performs the autopsy under contract with the Kane County Coroner's Office. She concludes Noreen died with a 3.3-inch complex and branching laceration on the upper left side of her head and a second 1-inch laceration on the upper right side. On internal examination, Dr. McElligott also identifies 2 subgaleal hemorrhages bleeding in the space between the scalp and the skull. The coroner finds no evidence of injury to Noreen's cervical spine.
Further, Dr. McElligott notes Noreen's injuries were not consistent with various scenarios involving Noreen having been thrown from a vehicle during a low-speed, low-impact accident and striking her head on an object, such as a door, a window, or a rock. Dr. McElligott explains that if a person were to fall out of a moving car, he would expect to find abrasions, contusions on the person's body, or even grass stains, none of which are present on Noreen's body.
Finally, the doctor concludes Noreen's death was caused by craniocerebral injuries due to blunt force trauma. Her injuries consistent with having sustained multiple blows to the head, and that the manner of death is homicide.
Well, if she was sitting in the passenger seat and fell out of the car, how could she have so much fractures on the left side of her head? I mean, when you listen to that, you're like, there's no way she died in a car accident, that there's little damage done to the car. Even if she fell out, how would she have more damage on that side of her head? You wouldn't fall out of the car that way. And that was part of the autopsy report that was, to me, very eye-opening.
It's an explosive revelation they've uncovered, but so much has changed since 1973.
I would say that everybody knew he was a really bad person, but somehow I think we all thought he was going to get away with it forever, that he was never going to be held accountable for.
And with so many years having passed, it will be a hard uphill battle to make any of this stick in a court of law. In 2015, 30 years after Noreen Kumeta Rudd was accidentally killed in a car crash, her exhumed body tells a very different story than her husband Donnie Rudd did to police that night.
The autopsy of Noreen Rudd confirmed she did not have a fracture of her cervical spine as originally thought. She did suffer craniocerebral injuries due to blunt force trauma, injuries consistent with having sustained multiple blows to the head, and not from hitting a rock, like Donnie told police that night in 1973.
Finally, in December 2015, Donnie Rudd is arrested at his home in Sugar Land, Texas, and charged with the murder of Noreen Kumeta Rudd.
And then when we heard that they had been changed to a homicide, we thought, well, they're going to arrest Donnie now. But it took them like another year. And we're kind of like, okay, well, if it's a homicide and he's the only person. But it was just like another thing, like he always got away with it. So we began to doubt that he was ever going to get arrested. And then suddenly he was arrested.
Police had one more ace up their sleeve in their attempts to nail Donnie Rudd for good.
In their interview with Donnie Rudd, investigators confront him about a substantial life insurance policy that Noreen had. It turns out everyone who worked for Quaker Oats had a standard policy. In case of accidental death, a named beneficiary would receive tens of thousands of dollars. Add to that, Donnie had mysteriously topped up his new life's policy to the tune of $100,000 in the weeks before she died.
Donnie denies knowing he was Noreen's beneficiary before she died, and he claims he gave most of the money away in the months after her death. Yet, his extravagant purchases tells a very different story. His stepdaughter's gift of a monkey for Christmas, his odd collection of expensive items, his Porsche. After all this time, police finally feel like they have enough pieces of the puzzle to tell the real story of what happened to young newlywed Noreen Kumeta Rudd, and why her own husband wanted her dead.
But will it be enough to put Donnie Rudd behind bars for good? Or will he find a way to reinvent history and slip from the grasp of justice, the way he has for the last 4 decades? After all this time, Donnie Rudd's fate will finally rest in the hands of a Cook County jury. It's 2018, more than 40 years since Noreen Kumeta Rudd was killed in a car accident, 27 days after she married the love of her life, Donnie Rudd. Now 76 years old and confined to a wheelchair, Donnie Rudd stands charged with his young bride's murder.
On the stand, Donnie denies all the charges and continues to tell his story that an oncoming car forced them off the road and that Noreen was thrown from the vehicle.
But Officer Bish takes the stand and shares his recollections of how Noreen's head felt mushy to his touch as he tried in vain to resuscitate her.
And then there's the forensics. 3 pathologists testify at Donnie's trial. The first, Dr. Hilary McElligott, performed the autopsy on Noreen after her body was exhumed from its final resting place.
Dr. McElligott tells the court she found no evidence of a broken spine, but did discover Noreen had a fractured skull, consistent with being bashed in the head with a blunt object.
A second pathologist testifies she agrees with Dr. McElligott's findings. A vicious blow to the head killed Noreen Kumeta Rudd. But it all threatens to fall apart for the prosecution when a third medical expert, Dr. Robert Hurwitz, takes the stand.
Dr. Hurwitz says he also examined the autopsy photograph and x-rays. His conclusion, he tells the jury, Noreen died of internal decapitation after being thrown from a car.
Could this dissenting opinion cast enough doubt in the jury's mind to let Donnie Rudd go free?
Dr. Hurwitz had told the court he believed Noreen died instantly of internal decapitation after being thrown from a car. But state attorneys quickly start poking holes in Dr. Hurwitz's credentials. Turns out, he is a diagnostic radiologist, not a forensic pathologist. And Dr. Hurwitz has never performed an actual autopsy. He insists he has performed virtual autopsies using MRI machines and CT scans on corpses and cadavers during his time in Nevada.
Prosecutors have poked as many holes in Dr. Hurwitz's story as they can, but they don't know if the disputed autopsy findings have planted seeds of doubt in the jury's minds.
With one ace left up their sleeve, prosecutors present their final piece of evidence they hope the court will not ignore. The 4 maximum term life insurance policies Donnie took out from Quaker Oats and received after Noreen's accidental death.
Good, bad, and ugly, the jury has heard the entire case against Donnie Rudd. They retired to deliberate, and now all everyone can do is wait. But after just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury sends a note to signal they have reached a verdict. And they return to the courtroom.
When a jury comes to a conclusion this quickly, it can mean one of 2 things. Either they all agree the accused is guilty, or they all agree there isn't enough evidence to convict the accused beyond a shadow of a doubt. This case is a tricky one, because the evidence is so old and there's no smoking gun that points definitively one way or the other. It really could go either way.
But it appears Donnie Rudd won't be able to manipulate himself out of it this time. In July 2018, in a courtroom in Rolling Meadows, Illinois, Donnie Rudd is convicted of snuffing out the light of sweet, young Noreen Kumeta Rudd. His bond is revoked, and he is taken into custody immediately.
You know, once they exhumed Noreen's body and it, established the forensic facts of what happened, I don't think my testimony was pivotal in any way at the trial.
The lawyer who prosecuted Donnie calls him a, quote, true sociopath, a narcissist who views people as objects to be used for his own benefit.
Everyone was moved by this case, even Circuit Court Judge Mark Martin, who delivered an emotional 8-hour decision on Donnie Rudd's sentence.
Donnie Rudd's punishment for killing his wife and lying about it for decades? 75 to 150 years in prison. For a man nearly 80 years old already, it was as sure of a death sentence as Judge Martin could hand down.
It was bittersweet. It was just like, you wish things had happened so much longer ago. I think that we were happy that the truth was found, and that, an innocent, people in a jury that found him guilty listened to the evidence, and they're the ones who came up with it. Because the question we asked for, years and years and years was, did he do it?
My mom used to say, there's no such thing as a coincidence when it comes to Donnie Rudd. I can still hear her saying that, and I think that was, probably a truism.
Donnie appeals his conviction, attempting one more time to use his charm and wits to get himself out of trouble. But this time, nobody is fooled. He lives for 4 years in prison before he succumbs to colon cancer and dies behind bars.
I don't know how that's ever justice. Donnie got to go free all those years. You know, they thought that Noreen had died tragically in something that was an accident. And to come back, 10 years later, or however long before they actually realized the truth. We'll never know a lot of the answers, and Donnie's not capable of telling the truth because most sociopaths aren't. They're just not capable of telling the truth.
I used to say Donnie was like the Phoenix. He would have these spectacular incidents where you just really thought it was the end for, who he was and what he was doing. And it always passed.
To us, it answered a question that we asked ourselves for years. Because even though we know we should have believed that he did it, it was hard to believe that he got away with it for so long.
What started out as a fantasy life for Noreen Kumeta Rudd turned into a nightmare, and she was mercilessly silenced for 45 years. But when the young bride herself speaks out from the grave, her husband's veil of deceit is removed, and the truth is revealed, putting Donnie Rudd behind bars until his own fateful death. It's 1991, and Noreen Kumeta Rudd's life is a distant memory after a fatal car crash in 1973.
Her grieving husband, Donnie Rudd, has moved on with a new wife and a successful law practice.
Then, tragedy strikes again. A client of Donnie's is gunned down in cold blood in the middle of the afternoon. And police have just learned a car with the license plate Mr. Kondo was seen in the area that day.
The only person with a plate like that, Donnie Rudd.
It's a big break for homicide detectives because Mr. Kondo is a custom license plate. Drivers pay specifically to have these kinds of plates, and they're registered with the DMV.
Investigators make a beeline for Donnie and bring him in for questioning. This may be an open and shut case, but the interrogation doesn't go quite according to plan.
The focus was on Donnie in that investigation from the very beginning. Donnie, I'm sure, had stole the money, but Donnie had never gotten the judgment. He just forged a document.
It's 1994, 3 years after her murder, and several complaints are filed with the Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission from others who also claim Donnie cheated them out of money. Donnie is cited for unlawful conduct, and in 1994 voluntarily withdraws his law license.
Donnie Rudd basically ruins his reputation in Chicago and Illinois. So what does he do? He takes the show on the road and returns with Diane back to his home state of Texas.
And with his confidence, smarts, and charm, Donnie does what he does very well and reinvents himself. He becomes an expert in, of all things, stem cell research.
Donnie Rudd establishes a company called Regenitech in Sugar Land, Texas, where he is listed as the chief scientist, director of intellectual property, and corporate secretary. He takes out more than 40 patents. Most are related to cell regeneration, repair of human tissue, and curing diseases to vital organs. He works with NASA to send human cells into space.
It's another fresh start, but he's unaware the past is starting to creep up on him.
For Donnie, the deaths of Noreen Kumeta Rudd and Loretta Tabak feel like a lifetime ago. But for the families of the two women, they refuse to allow the past to be buried so easily.
Detective Sperando pours through the paperwork, and he sees all the same evidence cops did at the time of the shooting.
And push for the investigations to continue.
Loretta Tabak Rodkey's daughter Stephanie hates that her mother's murder remains unsolved and her killer still roams free. So she keeps up the pressure on police to re-examine the case. Finally, after years, Officer Richard Sperando of the Arlington Heights Police Department agrees to take another look.
He started reinvestigating Loretta's case, and that was because Loretta's daughter was very persistent, which, led to them talking to us again and listening.
No forced entry, no signs of a struggle, the Mr. Condo license plate, Donnie Rudd's admission he was at Loretta's house that day, but no concrete evidence to connect him to the actual murder. Sperando does notice that in the files there's a second unusual and tragic death connected to Donnie Rudd. This one from way back in 1973. The victim, Noreen Kumeta Rudd.
The police commander has worked enough cases to know when something doesn't feel right. And after reading about the fatal car accident involving Donnie and Noreen, his cop instinct kicks in. Detective Sperando decides to reach out to a colleague who was there that day, Officer Christopher Bish.
Officer Bish tells Sperando the Noreen Kumeta Rudd case has haunted him for years and years. Bish says he remembers Noreen's head being mushy as he tried to resuscitate her, and that the coroner ruled her death due to a fracture of the cervical spine, but didn't actually perform an autopsy, so he never understood how he came to that conclusion.
Detective Sperando has heard enough. He now knows there's only one person who can reveal the truth of what really happened that night in 1973. So, nearly 30 years after her death, Sperando files the paperwork to exhume the body of Noreen Kumeta Rudd.
Forensic pathologist Dr. Hilary McElligott performs the autopsy under contract with the Kane County Coroner's Office. She concludes Noreen died with a 3.3-inch complex and branching laceration on the upper left side of her head and a second 1-inch laceration on the upper right side. On internal examination, Dr. McElligott also identifies 2 subgaleal hemorrhages bleeding in the space between the scalp and the skull. The coroner finds no evidence of injury to Noreen's cervical spine.
Further, Dr. McElligott notes Noreen's injuries were not consistent with various scenarios involving Noreen having been thrown from a vehicle during a low-speed, low-impact accident and striking her head on an object, such as a door, a window, or a rock. Dr. McElligott explains that if a person were to fall out of a moving car, he would expect to find abrasions, contusions on the person's body, or even grass stains, none of which are present on Noreen's body.
Finally, the doctor concludes Noreen's death was caused by craniocerebral injuries due to blunt force trauma. Her injuries consistent with having sustained multiple blows to the head, and that the manner of death is homicide.
Well, if she was sitting in the passenger seat and fell out of the car, how could she have so much fractures on the left side of her head? I mean, when you listen to that, you're like, there's no way she died in a car accident, that there's little damage done to the car. Even if she fell out, how would she have more damage on that side of her head? You wouldn't fall out of the car that way. And that was part of the autopsy report that was, to me, very eye-opening.
It's an explosive revelation they've uncovered, but so much has changed since 1973.
I would say that everybody knew he was a really bad person, but somehow I think we all thought he was going to get away with it forever, that he was never going to be held accountable for.
And with so many years having passed, it will be a hard uphill battle to make any of this stick in a court of law.